We continue Pompey from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. For the city now, at once, began to roll and swell, so to say, with the stir of the coming storm. Things everywhere were in a state of agitation, and everybody's discourse tended to division, now that death had put an end to that relation which hitherto had been a disguise rather than restraint to the ambition of these men. Besides, not long after came messengers from Parthia with intelligence of the death of Crassus there, by which another safeguard against civil war was removed, since both Caesar and Pompey kept their eyes on Crassus, and awe of him held them together, more or less within the bounds of fair dealing all his lifetime. But when fortune had taken away this second, whose province it might have been, to revenge the quarrel of the conquered, you might then say with the comic poet, the combatants are waiting to begin, smearing their hands with dust and oiling each his skin. So inconsiderable a thing is fortune in respect to human nature, and so insufficient to give content to a covetous mind, that an empire of that mighty extent and sway could not satisfy the ambition of two men, and though they knew and had not read that the gods, when they divided out twixt three this massive universe, heaven, hell, and sea, each one sat down contented on his throne, and undisturbed each god enjoys his own. And imagine if the Christian Trinity idea translated over into that. Yet they thought the whole Roman Empire was not sufficient to contain them, though they were but two. Pompey, once in an oration to the people, told them that he had always come into office before he expected he should, and that he had always left it sooner than they expected he would, and, indeed, the disbanding of all his armies witnessed as much. Yet when he had perceived that Caesar would not so willingly discharge his forces, he endeavored to strengthen himself against him by offices and commands in the city, but beyond this he showed no desire for any change, and would not seem to distrust, but rather to disregard and contemn him. And when he saw how they bestowed the places of government quite contrary to his wishes, because the citizens were bribed in their elections, he let things take their course, and allowed the city to be left without any government at all. Hereupon there was mentioned straightway made of appointing a dictator. Lucullus, a tribune of the people, was the man who first ventured to propose it, urging the people to make Pompey dictator. But the tribune was in danger of being turned out of his office by the opposition that Cato made against it, and for Pompey many of his friends appeared and excused him, alleging that he never was desirous of the government, neither would he accept of it. When Cato therefore made a speech in commendation of Pompey, and exhorted him to support the cause of good order in the commonwealth, he could not for shame but yield to it, and so for the present Domitius and Messala were elected consuls. But shortly afterwards, when there was another anarchy or vacancy in the government, and the talk of a dictator was much louder and more general than before, those of Cato's party, fearing that they should be forced to appoint Pompey, thought it policy to give him from that arbitrary and tyrannical power by giving him an office of more legal authority. Bibulus himself, who was Pompey's enemy, first gave his vote in the Senate that Pompey should be created consul alone, alleging that by these means either the commonwealth would be freed from the present confusion, or that its bondage should be lessened by serving the worthiest. This was looked upon as a very strange opinion, considering the man that spoke it, and therefore on Cato's standing up, everybody expected that he would have opposed it, but after silence made, he said that he would never have been the author of that advice himself, but since it was propounded by another, his advice was to follow it, adding that any form of government was better than none at all, and that in a time so full of distraction he thought no man fitter to govern than Pompey. This counsel was unanimously approved of, and a decree passed that Pompey should be made sole consul, with this clause, that if he thought it necessary to have a colleague, he might choose whom he pleased, provided it were not till after 2 months expired. This was Pompey created and declared sole consul by Sulpicius, regent in this vacancy, upon which he made very cordial acknowledgments to Cato, professing himself much his debtor, and requesting his good advice in conducting the government. To this Cato replied that Pompey had no reason to thank him, for all that he had said was for the service of the commonwealth, not of Pompey, but that he would be always ready to give his advice privately if it were asked for, and if not, he should not fail to say what he thought in public. Such was Cato's conduct on all occasions. On his return into the city, Pompey married Cornelia, the daughter of Metellus Scipio, not a maiden, but lately left a widow by Publius, the son of Crassus, her first husband, who had been killed in Parthia. The young lady had other attractions besides those of youth and beauty, for she was highly educated, played well upon the lute, and understood geometry, and had been accustomed to listen with profit to lectures on philosophy. All this, too, without any degree of becoming unamiable or pretentious, as sometimes young women do when they pursue such studies. Well, if you make philosophy about quotes rather than methods and principles, then pretty much anybody falls into that, right? Or at least they become so debased in a type of conservatism. Not that being a conservative is the same thing as nor could any fault be found either with her father's family or reputation. The disparity of their ages was, however, not liked by everybody, Cornelia being in this respect a fitter match for Pompey's son, and wiser judges thought it rather a slight upon the commonwealth when he, to whom alone they had committed their broken fortunes, and from whom alone, as from their physician, they expected a cure to these distractions, went about crowned with garlands and celebrating his nuptial feasts, never considering that his very consulship was a public calamity, which would never have been given him, contrary to the rules of law, had his country been in a flourishing state. You notice that's how they gear things, is they mess up things with the country, the economy, and war, all sorts of stuff to slip stuff in, daylight savings time, other stuff that they know is not good for us. I mean, that's a rather tame example. Losing 19 minutes of sleep a day on average for months out of the year is impressive enough, but that's a subtle one. I mean, that's actually the average per American, and other people who have this daylight savings thing happen. Afterwards, however, he took cognizance of the cases of these that had obtained offices by gifts and bribery, and enacted laws and ordinances setting forth the rules of judgment by which they should be arraigned, and regulating all things with gravity and justice. He restored security, order, and silence to their courts of judicature himself, keeping his presence there with a band of soldiers. But when his father-in-law Scipio was accused, he sent for the 360 judges to his house, and entreated them to be favorable to him, whereupon his accuser, seeing Scipio come into the court, accompanied by the judges themselves, withdrew the prosecution. Upon this Pompey was very ill spoken of, and much worse in the case of Plancus, for whereas he himself had made a law putting a stop to the practice of making speeches in praise of persons under trial, notwithstanding this prohibition he came into court and spake openly in commendation of Plancus, insomuch that Cato, who happened to be one of the judges at that time, stopping his ears with his hands, told him he could not in conscience listen to commendations contrary to the law. Cato upon this was refused and set aside from being a judge before a sentence was given, but Plancus was condemned by the rest of the judges to Pompey's dishonor. Shortly after, Hypsaeus, a man of consular dignity, who was under accusation, waited for Pompey's return from his bath to his supper, and falling down at his feet, implored his favor. But he disdainfully passed him by, saying that he did nothing else but spoil his supper. Such partiality was looked upon as a great fault in Pompey and highly condemned. However, he managed all things else discreetly, and having put their government in very good order, he chose his father-in-law to be his colleague in the consulship for the last 5 months. His provinces were continued to him for a term of 4 years longer, with a commission to take 1,000 talents yearly out of the treasury for the payment of his army. This gave occasion to some of Caesar's friends to think it reasonable that some consideration should be had of him too, who had done such signal services in war, and fought so many battles for the empire, alleging that he deserved at least a second consulship, or to have the government of his province continued, so that he might command and enjoy in peace what he had obtained in war, and no successor come in to reap the fruits of his labor and carry off the glory of his actions. There arising some debate about this matter, Pompey took upon him, as it were out of kindness to Caesar, to plead his cause and allay any justice that was conceived against him. Well, why stand in the way of justice if it's actually justice? Telling them that they had letters from Caesar expressing his desire for a successor, as own discharge from the command, but it would only be right that they should give him leave to stand for the consulship, though in his absence. But those of Cato's party, notwithstanding this, said, if he expected any favor from the citizens, he ought to leave his army and come in a private capacity to canvass for it. And Pompey's making no rejoinder, but letting it pass as a matter to which was overruled, increased the suspicion of his real feelings towards Caesar. Presently, also under pretense of a war with Parthia, he sent for his 2 legions, which he had lent him. However, Caesar, though he well knew why they were asked for, sent them home, very liberally rewarded. About that time Pompey recovered of a dangerous fit of sickness, which seized him at the Pauls, where the whole city, upon the suggestion of Praxagoras, made sacrifices of thanksgiving to what they considered to be gods for his recovery. And probably very specifically to ones related that would make him well versus, or that they thought as such, rather than just, or they could have just invoked everything and whatever that was willing. The neighboring towns likewise happening to follow their example, the thing then went its course throughout all Italy, so that there was not a city, either great or small, that did not feast and rejoice for many days together. And the company of those that came from all parts to meet him was so numerous that no place was able to contain them, but the villages, seaport towns, and the very highways were all full of people, feasting and sacrificing to what they considered to be their gods. Nay, many were to meet him with garlands on their heads, and flambeaux in their hands, casting flowers and nosegays upon him as he went along, so that this process of his in reception was one of the noblest and most glorious sights imaginable, and yet it is thought that this very thing was not of the least causes and occasions of the civil war, for Pompey, yielding to a feeling of exultation, which in the greatness of the present display of joy lost sight more of solid grounds of consideration, and abandoning the prudent temper which had guided him hitherto to a safe use of all his good fortune and his successes, gave himself up to an extravagant confidence in his own contempt of Caesar's power, insomuch that he thought neither force of arms nor care necessary against him, but that he could pull him down much easier than he had set him up. Besides this, Appius, under whose command those legions which Pompey lent to Caesar were returned, coming lately out of Gaul, spoke slightingly of Caesar's actions there, and spread scandalous reports about him, and at the same time telling Pompey that he was unacquainted with his own strength and reputation if he made use of any other forces against Caesar than Caesar's own, for such was the soldiers' hatred to Caesar, and their love to Pompey so great, that they would all come over to him upon his first appearance. But those flatteries Pompey was so puffed up and led on to such careless security that he could not choose but laugh at those who seemed to fear a war. It would be Pompey if this was a spelling. People always say Pompey, so might as well just say Pompey. But when some were saying that if Caesar should march against the city, they could not see what forces there were to resist him, he replied with a smile, bidding them be in no concern, for, said he, whenever I stamp with my foot in any part of Italy, there will rise up forces enough in an instant, both horse and foot. Caesar, on the other side, was more and more vigorous in his proceedings, himself always at hand about the frontiers of Italy, and sending his soldiers continually into the city to attend all elections with their votes. Besides, he corrupted several of his magistrates and kept them in his pay. Among others, Paulus the consul, who was brought over by a bribe of 1,500 talents, and Curio, tribune of the people, by a discharge of the debts with which he was overwhelmed, together with Mark Antony, who, out of friendship to Curio, had become bound with him in the same obligations for them all. And it was started as a fact that a centurion of Caesar's, waiting at the Senate house, and hearing that the Senate refused to give him a longer term of government, clapped his hands upon his sword and said, "But this shall give it." And indeed all his practices and preparations seemed to bear this appearance. Curio's demands, however, and requests in favor of Caesar were more popular in appearance, for he desired one of these two things, either that Pompey should be called upon to resign his army, or that Caesar's should not be taken away from him, for if both of them became private persons, both would be satisfied with simple justice, or if both retained their present power, each being a match for the other, they would be contented with what they already had. But he that weakens one does at the same time strengthen the other, and so doubles that very strength and power which he stood in fear of before. Marcellus the consul replied nothing to all this, but that Caesar was a robber, and should be proclaimed an enemy to the state if he did not disband his army. However, Curio, with the assistance of Antony and Piso, prevailed that the matter in debate should be put to the question and decided by vote in the Senate, so that it being ordered upon the question for those to withdraw who were of opinion that Caesar should lay down his army and Pompey command, the majority withdrew. But when it was ordered again for those to withdraw, whose vote was that both should lay down their arms and neither command, they were but 22 for Pompey. All the rest remained on Curio's side, whereupon he as one proud of his conquest, leaped out in triumph among the people, who received him with great tokens of joy, clapping their hands and crowning him with garlands and flowers. Pompey was not then present in the Senate, because it was not lawful for generals in command of an army to come into the city. But Marcellus, rising up, said that he would not sit there hearing speeches. When he saw 10 legions already passing the Alps on their march toward the city, but on his own authority would send someone to oppose them in defense of the country. Upon this, the city went into mourning as in a public calamity, and Marcellus, accompanied by the Senate, went solemnly through the forum to meet Pompey, and made him this address: I hereby give you orders, O Pompey, to defend your country, to employ the troops you now command, and to levy more. Lentulus, consul-elect for the year following, spoke to the same purpose. Antony, however, contrary to the will of the Senate, having in a public assembly read a letter of Caesar's containing various plausible overtures, such as were likely to gain the common people, proposing namely that both Pompey and he, quitting their governments and dismissing their armies, should submit to the judgment of the people and give an account of their actions before them. The consequence was that when Pompey began to make his levies, he found himself disappointed in his expectations. Some few indeed came in, but those very unwillingly. Others would not answer to their names, and the generality cried out for peace. Lentulus, notwithstanding he was now entered upon his consulship, would not assemble the Senate, but Cicero, who was lately returned from Cilicia, labored for a reconciliation, proposing that Caesar, together with the government of Illyricum, and should thus be put in nomination for a second consulship. Pompey, disliking this motion, Caesar's friends were contending that he should surrender one of the two, but Lentulus still opposing, and Cato crying out that Pompey did ill to be deceived again. The reconciliation did not take effect. In the meantime, news was brought that Caesar had occupied Ariminum, a great city in Italy, and was marching directly towards Rome with all his forces, but this latter was altogether false, for he had no more with him at that time than 300 horse and 5,000 foot, and he did not mean to tarry for the body of his army, which lay beyond the Alps, choosing rather to fall in on a sudden upon his enemies while they were in confusion, and did not expect him, than to give them time and fight them after they had made preparations. For when he came to the banks of Rubicon, a river that made the bounds of his province, there he made a halt, pausing a little and considering, we may suppose, with himself, the greatness of the enterprise which he had undertaken. Then, at last, like men that are throwing themselves headlong from some precipice into a vast abyss, having shut, as it were, his mind's eye, and put away from his sight the idea of danger, he merely uttered to those near him in Greek the words an eriptho kabos, aneriptho kabos, let the die be cast, and led his army through it. No sooner was the news arrived, but there was an uproar throughout all the city, and a consternation in the people, even to astonishment, such as never was known in Rome before. All the Senate ran immediately to Pompey, and the magistrates followed. And when Tullus made inquiry about his legions and forces, Pompey seemed to pause a little, and answered with some hesitation that he had these 2 legions ready that Caesar sent back, and that out of the men who had been previously enrolled, he believed he could shortly make up a body of 30,000 men, on which Tullus, crying out aloud, "O Pompey, you have deceived us," gave his advice to send off a deputation to Caesar. Favonius, a man of fair character, except that he used to suppose his own petulance and abusive talking a copy of Cato's straightforwardness, bade Pompey stamp upon the ground and call forth the forces he had promised. But Pompey bore patiently with this unseasonable raillery, and on Cato, putting him in mind of what he had foretold from the very beginning about Caesar, made this answer only, that Cato indeed had spoken more like a prophet, but he had acted more like a friend, Cato, than adviser. Missing letter. Then advised them to choose Pompey general with absolute power and authority, saying that the same men who did great evils knew best how to cure them. He himself went his way forthwith into Sicula, the province that was allotted him, and with the rest of the senators likewise departed every one to his respective government. Thus, all Italy, in a manner, being up in arms, no one could say what was best to be done, for those that were without came from all parts flocking into the city, and they were within, seeing the confusion and disorder so great there, all good things, impotent and disobedience and insubordination, grown too strong to be controlled by the magistrates, requiting it as fast as the others came in. Nay, it was so far from being possible to allay their fears, that they would not suffer Pompey to follow out his own judgment, but every man pressed and urged him according to his particular fancy, whether it proclaimed from doubt, fear, grief, or any meaner passion, so that even in the same day quite contrary counsels were acted upon them. Then again it was as impossible to have any good intelligence of the enemy, for what each man heard by chance upon a flying rumor, he would report for truth, and exclaim against Pompey if he did not believe it. Pompey at length, seeing such a confusion in Rome, determined with himself to put an end to their clamors by his departure, and therefore commanding all the Senate to follow him, and declaring that whosoever tarried behind should be judged a confederate of Caesar's, about the dusk of the evening he went out and left the city. The consuls also followed after in a hurry, without offering the sacrifices to what they considered to be gods and goddesses, as usual before a war. But in all this Pompey himself had the glory that in the midst of such calamities he had so much of men's love and goodwill. Now, some of these were definitely thought to be female of the war entities, because I want to make that part clear, because some people are like, well, I guess if you got this far, then you wouldn't have. All those Pompey himself had the glory that in the midst of such calamities he had so much immense love and goodwill. For though many found fault with the conduct of the war, yet no man hated the general, and there were more to be found of those that went out of Rome, because they could not forsake Pompey, than of those that fled for love of liberty. Some few days after Pompey was gone out, Caesar came into the city and made himself master of it, treating every one with a great deal of courtesy and appeasing their fears, except only Metellus, one of the tribunes, on whose refusing to let him take any money out of the treasury, Caesar threatened him with death, adding words yet harsher to the threat, that it was far easier for him to do it than to say it. By these means removing Metellus, and taking what moneys were of use for his occasions, he set forward in pursuit of Pompey, endeavoring with all speed to drive him out of Italy before his army that was in Spain could join him. But Pompey, arriving at Brundusium, and having plenty of ships there, bade the two consuls embark immediately, and with them shipped 30 cohorts of foot, bound before him for Tarhacium. He sent likewise his father-in-law, Scipio, and Canaus, his son, into Syria, to provide and fit out a fleet there, himself in the meantime having blocked up the gates, placed his lightest soldiers as guards upon the walls, and giving express orders that the citizens should keep within doors, he dug up all the ground inside the city, cutting trenches and affixing stakes and palisades throughout all the streets of the city except only 2 that led down to the seaside. Thus, in 3 days' space, having with ease put off the rest of his army on shipboard, he suddenly gave the signal to those that guarded the walls, who, nimbly repairing to the ships, were received on board and carried off. Chasar, meantime, perceiving their departure, by seeing the walls unguarded, hastened after, and in the heat of pursuit was all but entangled himself among the stakes and trenches. But the Brundusians, discovering the danger to him and showing him the way, he wheeled about, and taking a circuit round the city, made towards the haven, where he found all the ships on their way, excepting only 2 vessels that had but a few soldiers aboard. Most are of the opinion that this departure of Pompey's is to be counted among the best of his military performances, but Chasar himself could not but wonder that he, who was thus engarrisoned in a city well fortified, who was in expectation of his forces from Spain, and was master of the sea besides, should leave and abandon Italy. Cicero accuses him of imitating the conduct of Themistocles rather than of Pericles. Pericles is the Make Athens Great Again guy. There's a bigger series on him, although he's mentioned in here, right? When the circumstances were made like those of Pericles, then they were like those of Themistocles. However, it appeared plainly that Chasar showed it by his actions that he was in great fear of delay, for when he had taken Numerius, a friend of Pompey's prisoner, he sent him as an ambassador to Brundusium with offers of peace and reconciliation upon equal terms, but Numerius sailed away with Pompey, and now Chasar, having become master of all Italy in 60 days without a drop of bloodshed, had a great desire forthwith to follow Pompey, but being destitute of shipping, he was forced to divert his course and march into Spain, designing to bring over Pompey's forces there to his own.